time to get your Zaxxon. It's Segaiden episode 15. Sega launches into 1985 on a strong note with a home conversion of its shining arcade star, the dazzling isometric shooter Zaxxon. And unlike CONGO BONGO, the previous attempt to convert a home game to SG-1000 from this particular arcade hardware, Zaxxon is great. Coming hot on the heels of a great adaptation of Flicky and the memorable original Girl's Garden, it really feels like Sega has begun to turn a corner with its console lineup. There's still a fair amount of aggressive mediocrity in store for SG-1000, don't you worry, but compare Zaxxon to this console's version of CONGO BONGO and you get the impression that Sega is finally getting serious about its 8-bit system rather than treating it as a mere dalliance. In fact, big things are in store for the SG-1000 in 1985, including a complete new media format that will help make the system a competitive threat on the pricing front, and a brand new edition of the hardware that brings far more to the table than just the clean lines seen in the SG-1000 II. And what game could be more appropriate to this task than Zaxxon? Originally the sibling release for CONGO BONGO, Zaxxon hit the arcades with Gale Force Thrills in 1982, where CONGO BONGO more or less amounted to Donkey Kong, but fancier. Zaxxon gave players a shoot-'em-up sensation unrivaled by anything besides Namco's Xevious. There's a certain kindred spirit to Zaxxon and Xevious, really. Both games offered shoot-'em-up space thrills in a simulation of 3D space, each one taking its own unique approach to the concept. As we've seen in NES Works Gaiden, Xevious more or less worked like GALAGA, with the addition of movement along the vertical axis, a wallpaper of scenery scrolling past beneath the player's ship, and the ability to utilize an alternate firing mechanism that allowed players to interact with, by which I mean shoot, objects on the ground layer in addition to flying foes. However, Xevious still amounted to gaming action in a 2D space, with the third dimension merely implied by the fact that the Sovalu's ship-to-ship cannon couldn't affect objects presented as terrestrial. It was a simple scheme, but a convincing one. Zaxxon, on the other hand, takes a far more impressive approach to rendering three-dimensional space by presenting its world with a forced perspective. Xevious really amounted to two-axis action, vertical and horizontal, with the third axis limited to your ability to bomb whatever passed through the ship's ground targeting reticle. Zaxxon, on the other hand, plays fully in all three axes of space. This being a shoot-'em-up, the forward axis amounts to the direction in which your ship automatically flies and the direction in which all your projectiles fire. Unlike in Xevious, your movement in the forward axis is fixed to a single direction automatic scroll, but even if you can't actively move along that axis by your own agency, it nevertheless is a major element of the gameplay, since you're forced to move and attack in that direction. In the meantime, you have full lateral movement for your ship. That's been a given in the shooter genre since Space Invaders. Even before that, really, if you consider some of the electromechanical arcade amusements that predate Invaders. In this case, your ship, which, according to the SG-1000 instruction manual, is the eponymous Zaxxon, much to my surprise after decades of having been told Zaxxon is the name of the missile-launching robot you're trying to destroy. Anyway, Zaxxon banks left and right to move into position and attack foes. But it also needs to move laterally in order to avoid obstacles and hazards, such as walls and incoming ships. What sets Zaxxon apart is the fact that in addition to these two spatial factors, you also need to deal with altitude. Again, in Xevious, altitude is merely intimated by the fact that tanks can only be destroyed with an air-to-ground bomb. Here, however, it plays a material role in the action. As your ship advances forward automatically and jukes left and right to zip through the field of combat, it also needs to rise and descend in order to navigate the spaces you encounter. More than simply a matter of casting a shadow against a flat sheet of pixels, the X-axis allows your ship to both interact with and avoid enemies and the world's topography. The game begins by confronting you with a sheer brick wall that can only be passed by climbing to maximum altitude and passing through the narrow gap at the top of the structure. If you simply fly ahead at your default altitude, you'll smash into the wall without ever actually seeing the actual game. Once you enter the first base, your altitude determines the vertical level at which you attack foes. Ground-based enemies can't hurt you if you fly above them, but at the same time you can't destroy them either. However, there's no long-term advantage to simply sailing over the heads of the ground forces, as you won't earn any points, and more crucially, will eventually run out of fuel. Yeah, while there might be a natural inclination to compare Zaxxon to Xevious, given the massive popularity and reach of the latter title among Japanese arcade goers and console owners in the 80s, those games actually appeared at roughly the same time in arcades. Their respective expressions of a third axis in the shooter genre amounted to two different solutions for the same problem, happening concurrently, not a game of one-upsmanship. To find the true inspiration behind Zaxxon, you need look no further than Konami's breakout arcade hit, Scramble, a horizontally scrolling shooter that took both air and ground-based elements into account. Scramble saw a small fighter craft blasting other fighters out of the air while also bombing ground-based emplacements, most notably fuel tanks, whose destruction would somehow top off their fighters' energy reserve. Zaxxon essentially lifts the entire concept of Scramble from Konami, then skews it at a 45-degree angle to give it three-dimensionality. The end result is not some bland, derivative creation, but rather a transformative work that completely reinvents the genre, resulting in a combination shooting game and obstacle course that crisscrosses the screen with energy barriers, projectiles, missile launches, and more. The SG-1000 offers a convincing take on the arcade original. It compares well to the ColecoVision from a few years earlier, with several distinct differences, some for the better, some not. The first and most obvious change Zaxxon fans will find here is the reverse control scheme. Or should that be non-reversed? The arcade and Coleco renditions of Zaxxon gave the fighter proper plane-style controls, where pressing up on the joystick would lower the craft's nose and cause it to descend. This was a weird new concept for mainstream gaming at the time, and most freshman Zaxxon play sessions ended with the hapless player's craft smashing into the first wall. Sega evidently thought better of this concept when bringing the game to consoles, and retooled the interface to work along the lines of more traditional video games. Press up, and your fighter climbs rather than descending. This takes a little getting used to if your brain is wired to other versions of Zaxxon, but it definitely makes the game more intuitive for newcomers. And speaking of your fighter craft, this port incorporates another major change from other versions of the game. Again, according to the manual, Zaxxon is now the name of your ship rather than that of the evil robot you're trying to destroy. This makes no difference for gameplay, but it is an odd tweak that sets this release at odds with every other version of the game that I've ever experienced. Then again, maybe they decided to reserve the eponymous name for the player's vessel because the evil robot at the end is so underwhelming. Normally, Zaxxon, the robot, appears as an imposing angular menace that towers over your ship. It's an almost humanoid figure, vaguely reminiscent of Maximilian from Disney's The Black Hole, with a pyramidal radome for a head and a ballistic missile tucked under what appears to be its arm. Here, however, the robot is a flicker of a target, a single-colored machine that appears to consist only of the arcade enemy's chest section. On top of that, it takes a curiously long time to even reach the robot in this version. In other versions of Zaxxon, you face the robot after completing a cycle of navigating enemy fortresses. You fight through an asteroid base, then battle through space, then enter another base and destroy the robot at the end. Here you have to complete 3 cycles of bases in space, beating the robot only after conquering no less than 4 fortresses and 3 space fighter waves. The fighter waves take place in the void of space, with no scenery to dodge. Enemy vessels approach in groups while changing altitude to attack your ship, forcing you to line up your vertical height with foes in order to destroy them. The fortress sequences remain largely consistent with other versions of Zaxxon, and those are the parts that people remember about the game. Flying low lets you blast ground-based foes and fuel tanks, though you need to be mindful of the missile silos embedded in the surface. They frequently launch ICBMs at you and can strike you from below. You also need to weave around barriers, such as walls and energy shields. Shields typically span the width of a fortress, with only a small gap in the wall beneath them to slip through that forces you to line up your movement. These serve as tests of your ability to judge your position in 3D space. While details like the alternate control scheme and the new look for the evidently not Zaxxon robot at the end of each phase are fairly trifling and don't affect the gameplay in any material way, Zaxxon on SG-1000 does suffer from one unavoidable defect: choppy scrolling. The SG-1000's lack of smooth hardware scrolling can be rough on shooters, and that remains true here too. I would say the angular perspective on the visuals helps things move more smoothly overall than in games with traditional perspectives like Starjacker. Even so, the stop-start motion can be mildly detrimental in tight quarters and when performing precise maneuvers. The stuttering advancement of your ship through the fortress really becomes clear when you're trying to slip quickly into place to line up with, say, a fuel tank or a gun turret. Swinging down to surface level to take out a handful of tanks after passing through the high gap of the final wall of a fortress is a key tactic for topping off your energy before entering a space phase, but it requires a level of finesse and precision that the SG-1000 version makes a little trickier than it needs to be. Despite these quirks, this is still a deft and highly playable rendition of a Keystone arcade classic. As someone who grew up playing the ColecoVision port to the point of exhaustion, I find the SG-1000 adaptation to be every bit as good and every bit as satisfying. Simply different. Make no mistake, Zaxxon may have been a strong lead-in to 1985 for SG-1000, but by no means will every game released for the system this year be great. Case in point, Champion Pro Wrestling. At this point, I think SG enthusiasts likely have a Pavlovian response to the word champion. Only a handful of the releases to have appeared under Sega's Champion banner to date have felt like real competitors for the sort of sports games showing up in arcades and on other consoles and computers around the same time. Champion Pro Wrestling has the advantage of not having a whole lot of direct competition at this point. Likewise, it also plays a fair bit better than the game upon which its tech appears to be based, Champion Boxing. As in Champion Boxing, you control one of two characters in a ring, maneuvering back and forth in relation to your opponent, and selecting actions from a menu in order to execute them. Champion Pro Wrestling looks less impressive than Champion Boxing, with much smaller characters taking part in the competition, but it plays a bit better. A bit. This is still a clunky and frequently frustrating way to go about the act of wrestling. In order to perform any maneuver whatsoever, you need to cue it up from a menu by tapping one button, then press the other button when standing the proper distance from your opponent in order to perform that action. But every time you act, your command menu resets, forcing you to cycle through possible actions, even if your attack whiffs. There is a nice sense of satisfaction when you do manage to connect. Most of the time, though, you'll find that the CPU seems to have command priority and can disrupt your actions, meaning you'll miss or take a hit. The CPU opponent also seems to have very little trouble cycling through commands, giving it a real knack for catching you in cheesy loops that leave you helpless to defend yourself. But every once in a while you might get lucky and manage to lock the computer in a stun loop. But these moments are fleeting and never quite enough to give you the upper hand. No, this is an 8-bit sports game, which means it's pretty miserable as a single-player experience. You'll want to play against another human in order to experience something approaching fun, which, to Champion Pro Wrestling's credit, is at least an option here, unlike in the single-player Champion Boxing. Of course, Sega owes its greatest debt here not to itself, but rather to Technos Japan. Long before a punk named Kunio entered high school, years before Dragons went double and River City was held for ransom, Technos created the definitive arcade wrestling action game of the era with Tag Team Wrestling. We've seen SAS Sakata's port of Tag Team Wrestling on NES Works, of course, but that version was a mess, with an interface far more frustrating and uncooperative than Champion Pro Wrestling's could ever dream of being. Sega fans would have to wait until the following year for Master System's Pro Wrestling to enjoy a more direct and intuitive take on the sport, which is a shame because Sega already had published a less cumbersome take on wrestling to arcades in 1984 with the bizarrely named Apo. Sega Retro suggests Champion Pro Wrestling may be a loose adaptation of Apo, but loose is definitely the operative word here. The arcade game lacked command menus, instead giving players a 3-button interface that they could use for direct grappling. The SG-1000 lacked a third button, so I suppose if this really is meant to be an Apo conversion, the addition of menus was the best Sega could do to make that button combo system work in this context. And for all its clumsiness, Champion Pro Wrestling does at least attempt to match the cadence of a wrestling match. Simply punching, grappling, and slamming your opponent doesn't equal victory. Rather, you need to whittle down their stamina meter so you can pin them for a 3 count once you knock them down. This too is something that proves to be far fussier for the player than the CPU, but that's probably to be expected of a sports game of this vintage. I suppose there's some reassurance to be found in the fact that no one was doing pro wrestling much justice on consoles at this point. You'd be hard-pressed to say Champion Pro Wrestling is appreciably worse than Muscle Tag Team Match or Tag Team Wrestling on NES. You'd be hard-pressed to say it's better, too. It's just kind of there. A reminder that these were the early days of video gaming, and even surefire successes, pro wrestling, the most video game of all sports, had a long way to go before they'd really work. Next on Segaiden, a few more underwhelming releases for the SG-1000 before the system turns a crucial corner.